I have this is Dan Roper from Grand Rapids. I guess just a question. We're still kind of in the early phases of implementation, only a few months, and with COVID, I've really kind of done our first major push on this just within the last few weeks or so. The question at our group is also about alcohol intoxication, not surprisingly, and it's I guess somewhat reassuring to hear that other sites struggle with this as well. One point that hasn't really been discussed is, if the group traditionally uses a lot of Nexus for the C-spine, and they don't use Canadian for the C-spine, alcohol intoxication is a criteria for the Nexus. So you get into this position where, if you're using Nexus for the C-spine and Canadian for the head, are you really going to just scan the neck and not the head? Or, and we're working through that. And one of the recommendations, might just be to use the Canadian CT neck rule instead of the Nexus rule. I'm curious if other groups have that same link or discussion. Are they trying to separate and really just make the CT of the head and neck completely separate algorithms and combine them less? Or are people also pushing to get rid of Nexus and use Canadian when they're deciding on the neck as well?
I don't have a great answer for you, but agree that is from time to time a source of the problem. I can tell you that maybe that's the next medic measure, is cervical spine CTs, because we get them on every single stroke. Because while they're there, they say, let's get it, how do you know? If the patient's had a stroke, did they fall? Didn't they fall? We don't know. And if I've already got them there, it's an extra couple of seconds and they radiate the neck. And, we probably get an awful lot of CT of the C-spine that we probably don't need either. So, maybe that's something that we look at in the future for a medic measure. I don't know. But yeah, that's a complicating factor. I don't know how others are addressing it.
I'll offer a few comments. This is Keith Coker. And I don't necessarily have the evidence immediately at my fingertips or those studies. My sort of impression of sort of Nexus as a research group versus basically Ian Steele and his research group in Ottawa and the Canadian rules is those rules aren't necessarily linked together. I mean, the Canadian head CT rule, the Canadian C-spine rules, those weren't derived in the same cohort of patients. Those are very sort of different studies. And effectively, these were competing research groups, Nexus versus the Canadian group. So I don't think it's wrong to necessarily apply a Nexus head C-spine rule and a Canadian head CT rule. I think those are perfectly legitimate ways to approach an evidence-based decision. It's interesting, Dan, that you brought up the Nexus head CT rule because, again, I referenced this in my earlier comments. I mean, we did spend the first year of MEDIC sort of sorting through the evidence to land on a gold standard, basically between the Canadian head CT rule, the New Orleans head CT rule, and the Nexus head CT rule. And at the end of the day, we sort of as a group chose the Canadian rule, I think, for a variety of reasons. Part of which is because there was a lot of unfamiliarity, to be honest, with the Nexus head CT rule. I can understand somebody wanting to choose, say, that rule because there is it does perform well as opposed to the New Orleans rule. But I don't think it's wrong, you know, at the end of the day, to really sort of directly answer your question, Dan, I don't think it's wrong to have a Canadian head CT rule and a Nexus C-spine rule. They can operate like perfectly well together and not conflict.
Right. I just think there's a natural bias that if you're sending someone to the scanner, I mean, we hear this from trauma all the time. Oh, well, just, you know, just do them both, or just, you know, pan scan them. So it takes a certain amount of intentionality to only do the neck and not the head, which
Sure.
we're capable of, but it, I think, requires some thought and intentionality and some documentation.
Yes, I certainly understand, you know, being a clinician myself, about some of that sort of inertia that happens. I mean, we'll say, like, you know, for the exact scenario where it's a sort of trauma activation, I mean, those cases actually do not end up in the denominator with which we measure, because we certainly understand that there are other players in that decision. But still, even when it's an independent decision and solely in the ED hands, yeah, I get that there's sometimes this challenge about how can I only CT one body part, and you have a head as well as a neck. Yes. You know, I'll just say one other thing. You know, Blaine said that it's in his comments, we are gearing up to use the MEDIC registry to empirically study this question of, you know, does intoxication impart additional predictive power to severe head injuries? Now, that was not shown in the original Canadian head CT rule. If you read that study carefully, you know, clearly they address that within the study. If you were to ask Ian Steele on the spot, in fact, we had the opportunity to do that a couple years ago when he spoke at our meeting, he would tell you the very same thing. But nevertheless, you know, we intend to study that, and Blaine's leading that effort.